All right. Hello, and welcome to Crisis Communications, Managing and Avoiding Crises with Media Monitoring. I'm Jordan Goslin, and I'm a marketing specialist with CARMA. We're a global monitoring intelligence company providing monitoring and integrated analytics around the world. I'm happy that you could join us for today's session, where we'll discuss handling crises before, during, and after they occur. We'll also cover how media monitoring can help organizations plan and prevent crises. So today I'm joined by our host, Shel Holtz. Shel is a principal for Holtz Communication and Technology. Thanks for joining, Shel.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And co-hosting with Shel is Jen Zingsimes-Phillips, the founder of 4L Strategies. Thanks for being here, Jen. All right. And for those of you listening, there will be a period at the end for questions. So I invite you to submit any questions that you may have throughout the session in the chat box at the end. There's a little panel there for questions. And today's session is also being recorded, and that recording is going to be available on CARMA's YouTube channel after this. So keep an eye out for that. All right, and so I'm going to hand it over to Shel and Jen, and they can start talking about what a crisis is and how to plan for it before one even emerges.
Great. Thanks, Jordan. And Jen, great to talk to you. Jen and I have a lot of experience talking with each other through podcasting. So fun to be with you, Jen.
It's great to be here with you, Shel.
There you are. Great. Yeah, it's always fun.
Yep.
So
I'm here.
I think the definition of a crisis is always interesting. I keep reading, particularly these days in the wake of United Airlines and Pepsi, that these are all PR crises, and I get a little disgruntled when I see that, because the crisis may be something that PR has to handle, but PR didn't create the crisis. I also see the term social media crisis, which bothers me. I know Melissa Agnes, a crisis expert, did a whole video saying they're not social media crises because that's not where they started. That's just where people are talking about them. But the definition of a crisis to me is anything that you weren't expecting that threatens your reputation, your profitability, and your license to operate. Jen, are you there?
I am.
Oh, good. I just wondered if that was something that you agreed with.
Absolutely. It's funny to even think that you have to codify what exactly a crisis is, but when people talk about social media being a crisis, it is exactly right. That's not where it starts. People say, "Oh, I have a Google problem." It's not a Google problem. It's something that's happened in your own company, and that's where you have to address things, where they need to be fixed first.
Right, and I always like to focus on the unexpected, because it may be an emergency or a tragedy or all kinds of terrible things. I always like to point. Well, I don't like to, but I point to plane crashes, which are horrible and awful. But airlines drill for these. It's something that they know could happen. They have procedures and guidelines. And when it happens, they know exactly what to do. And I think the crisis occurs when you find out that there was poorly done maintenance, or the pilot deliberately crashed the plane, or something like that turns it into a crisis. And before that, like I say, it's a tragedy, it's an emergency, but because it's something we anticipate, it's not really a crisis, and that's one of the reasons I think you need to have a crisis plan that is flexible, and training and drilling that helps leaders make good decisions when the unexpected happens. So what's on the screen right now is a list of givens that leaders and communicators should understand when a crisis happens. I'm going to run through these quickly, and then Jen, you can weigh in on any of them. But the first of these is that the public is risk averse. Right? I mean, I've seen too many crises where the spokesperson, whether it's the CEO or a PR representative or the plant manager or whatever, gets up and starts citing facts. And facts don't matter to the public in a crisis. What matters to them is, oh my God, am I okay? Are my friends and family all right? Is this going to happen again? Is this something I should worry about, right? It's a very emotional reaction to the threat that whatever has happened brings to them. So we have to go into it knowing that we have to address a public that is, feeling distressed and upset and nervous about the crisis. The next thing is that when the CEO or the PR rep gets up to address the crisis, there's a heavy dose of skepticism applied to them from the public, because it is in their interest and the company's interest for them to minimize, to make sure everybody thinks that everything's okay. And therefore, we need to look at spokespeople who have more credibility. If you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer from this year, CEO credibility is at an all-time low across every dimension. People just don't trust them, and those of us who are paid to speak for the company, go in with that handicap of, they're just here to talk in order to make us all feel better, and go continue to buy their product or use their service or invest in their stock or what have you. We do rely to a large extent in a crisis in getting our message out through the media. And no matter what kind of relationship you have built with reporters, in a crisis, they're there to report to the public what's going on. They're also there to present the story in a way that's going to get people to click on the headline or buy the newspaper or turn to the cable channel. They're not there to help you get through the crisis. And even though we have to rely on them to an extent to get our message out, we have to go into that conversation knowing that they're not an advocate for our organization. Their role is driven by conflict and threat, and if it bleeds, it leads, right? If you are dealing with a union or an environmentalist group or a consumer group, they're going to jump all over this in order to further their own agenda and to hold you up as an example of exactly the kind of threat that they have been talking about. So it's something to keep in mind, that they will exploit your crisis to their own advantage. I want to reiterate that emotion is how people come to a crisis, not logic, and that as soon as somebody has seen a picture of your crisis, it's going to be cemented in their minds. And if you think about some of the really memorable crises that organizations have suffered through over the past, I can mention the crisis and tell you the image that is popping up into your head, right? The Exxon Valdez almost always creates the image of oil-soaked dead birds floating at the shore of the Prince William Sound. If I talk about the Ford Explorer Firestone tire crisis, it's an overturned vehicle on a freeway with a lot of emergency vehicles around it. So there are symbols that get cemented in people's heads, and one of the jobs of the people handling the communication on a crisis is to change that image, to change that symbol. So I think these are things that you have to carry into a crisis that you just take for granted in your planning and when a crisis hits. Jen, thoughts on that?
Exactly. And, it's impossible to prepare for everything, but you can prepare for an awful lot. And I think that is probably, when you start thinking about where you would incorporate monitoring, and how you would work to plan things. Now, I know that in previous discussions, the airlines doing disaster drills about planes going down is absolutely, it's part and parcel to their line of work. They have to do this. They know it's a possibility. They, however, did not really think through what kind of PR work they would have to do when something completely random like that volcano in Iceland going and disrupting major airline patterns over the Atlantic Ocean, and basically stopping air travel for nearly a week because of a volcano going off. So as this first bullet says, it's just not feasible to plan for every single possible crisis, which is why, A, your monitoring is important, and B, just your planning of how you would address things is important.
Right. Yeah, I am frequently stunned at the number of organizations that don't have crisis plans. But even more, among the companies that do have crisis plans, they sit on a shelf or on a hard drive, and they don't get drilled. When I work with clients, I want to see that crisis plan drilled every quarter. And the idea is that you're going to abide by the company's values no matter what the crisis is, because you can't expect the volcanic ash to disrupt flights the way they did. Well, let's look at United Airlines and the passenger dragging instance from a couple of weeks ago. I'm sure that the people who do the communication there have never said, let's do some crisis planning around abusing a passenger who was already boarded on the plane, who was being asked to give up that seat for a crew member on the basis of an oversold flight and wouldn't go, and the airport police had to drag him off and he was injured. That's just, as that first bullet says, you're not going to anticipate that. But if your values say, the passengers come first, customer service is a priority here, then when the crisis hits, if you have been practicing that, then you'll be able to execute on that particular crisis by keeping those values in mind, top of mind. The classic example of this, and I hate to revert to Tylenol because it is everybody's go-to example of a crisis done well. And by the way, we do look through that. I think it was 1987. I think we looked through that with rose-colored glasses, and there's a lot that wasn't as ideal as it has been made out to be at this point. But Johnson & Johnson has a credo, and the credo says our most important audience is patients, the people who are taking our medications, whether they're over the counter or not, and it's other audiences come next, employees, and then the communities in which we operate, and shareholders were at the bottom. And the philosophy there is if we take care of our customers and we take care of our employees, the bottom line is going to take care of itself. And when that Tylenol crisis hit, the decision was ultimately made to remove that product, not just in the Chicago area where the tampered pills had been found, but nationwide. That meant there was a hit to the bottom line. They weren't going to be selling any Tylenol anywhere in the country until they ultimately innovated the safety seal. But the message that was sent was, we're not going to put anybody at risk, even though we have no information that tells us that these tampered Tylenol pills are anywhere but Chicago. We're not going to put our customers at risk. We're going to remove them nationwide. And then you innovate the safety seal, reintroduce the product that none of your competitors have. Nobody else had a safety seal. And not only did you get all your customers back, but you got competitors' customers to start buying your product because the competitor didn't have that solution. But it was going into the crisis knowing customer first, and therefore we're going to take this action that may not be best for the shareholder in the short term. Without that kind of drilling, without getting that to be a habit, most leaders are going to jerk their knee and say, we have to protect sales.
Exactly. And I was living in the Chicago area at the time, so I remember this vividly. Yes. And drilling does one other thing. It causes people to kind of go onto autopilot, which sounds bad, but it's actually good. You want to have it in your head that you know exactly what step A, step B, step C is. This is why, coming back to airlines, you hear the safety announcements at the beginning of every flight. No matter how many times you've been on it, it's good to have it top of mind. Now, the screen that's up is now pre-crisis monitoring, and this can actually give you some really good ideas on how to, not only watch your own brand and see what might be percolating potentially as a crisis, but also if your competitors have any crises, you can watch how they respond to things, and not only what they do right, but mistakes they make are ones that you can incorporate into your pre-crisis monitoring and drilling plans. Now, looking down this list, looking for unusual spikes in mentions, this is kind of, the ideal pre-crisis warning signs. You're not always going to have this. I mean, and especially with social, things can travel in an instant. However, if you have a situation where it's more of a slow bubble, pre-crisis monitoring will help you get on top of it early. Now, what would that be? Well, it could be things like, I don't know, E. coli sickness. You start seeing, one notification in one area of the country, and then another notification in another area of the country, and so something like that, if you're a food service or a restaurant industry, could tip you off to a potential crisis in the making. It's entirely possible that if there are only 2 or 3 mentions, they're all completely unrelated, or it could be, the advent of a real crisis, especially since, something like food poisoning, E. coli, can take 7 to 10 days to manifest from ingestion to illness. So.
Right. I read a quote years ago that said, and I'm not going to be verbatim here, but the essence of it was, crisis management is what you do when you don't do issues monitoring and identification. So having monitoring tools in place that allow you to see what people are talking about and when there's a spike in some kind of conversation. There was an article I just read. What was the date on this? This was May 11th. A team from Northwestern University developed a model to predict the spread of the flu in real time using Twitter, right? So, I mean, there's all kinds of different things that you can figure out are bubbling to the surface and getting out of hand if you're monitoring the right things. And if you work with an organization, a monitoring organization, like Custom Scoop, they can help you set up the right keyword tracking and make it easier to detect when people are talking about something. But Jen, you're absolutely right. Even if it's something that happens instantly, monitoring is going to give you, even if it's just 2 or 3 minutes warning, that can be time well used. And I'm thinking here, for example, of the U.S. Airways jet that landed in, made the emergency landing in the Hudson River. And here was a guy on a ferry that was diverted to go pick up the passengers who were standing on the wing of the plane, and he takes a picture with his iPhone and sends it out via Twitter, and hundreds of thousands of people, because that spread so quickly, saw that picture before the communications team at U.S. Airways even knew that there was a plane in the river. If somebody had been monitoring, if they had been getting the alerts that there's suddenly a surge in Twitter traffic around U.S. Airways, they could have been on top of that, many minutes earlier, and been able to start getting their ducks in a row, rather than have somebody call and say, hey, this is in full-blown crisis mode right now, and hundreds of thousands of people are talking about this.
Exactly. Okay.
So there's some other types of crises that you can identify, or issues that you can identify before they become crises. Dell has created a tool that uses multiple monitoring systems that allow them to determine not just that they're being talked about, but by whom, about what particular product. So they were able, the example I got when I was talking to somebody at Dell, and this is something they use internally, I'm not suggesting this is something you can go out and buy, but they determined that there was a group of developers who were hammering pretty hard on the developer model of one of their laptops. And so they were able to reach out to an expert on developer tools in the company to go into that community and read what they were saying, and it turned out they were complaining that they were paying something like $400 more for a laptop, and the only difference between that one and the consumer version was that it had a bunch of developer tools installed on it, all of which were free. It was all freeware. And this guy looked at it and said, you know what, they're right, and he was able to take that back to management, and within 24 hours they had lowered the price on that model, and they were able to mollify this mob that was sort of being created in this developers community and keep it from becoming a crisis. So another example of monitoring where something could start to have a real bad impact on your reputation, and deal with it before it gets to that point.
Right. Well, responding to a crisis is, I mean, it's just so important to make sure that you have planned this out, and that is a perfect example of how to get on top of it and address it before it becomes something really, really big. You know, the idea of organizing into teams and tackling different aspects of it, this is pretty pro forma in a lot of larger organizations, but I think it's something that smaller and medium-sized organizations don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about. And depending on the size and speed of the crisis, you could very well have an all-hands-on-deck type of situation. You're going to have a lot of people milling around who don't really know exactly what they should be doing but want to help. So again, planning is critical. If you have a big problem, and by big problem I mean there are either deaths or injuries involved, such as the Tylenol incident or such as the United, you're going to have the legal team involved. This is just, it's going to happen. The issue here is that PR professionals and communicators and the legal teams have basically different objectives. The PR professionals are making sure that the reputation of the organization is what we need to, you know, watch out for. Legal teams are watching out for, you know, potential liability and what could be said in a public forum. Can that be used against us in court? By saying we're sorry, are we saying that we're at fault? That sort of thing. So these questions come up time and time again. I wrote a piece for Media Bullseye not long ago, referenced a study that was done back in the year 2000, and really nothing has changed from when this professor wrote this paper studying the discrepancies between PR and legal and now. It was kind of eerie to read through, yep, that's still a problem, yep, that's still a problem. So it's something that needs to be addressed kind of head on. If legal and PR can get on the same page during practice drills, that's going to be of a huge benefit down the line if there ever is a crisis. Which brings us to responding quickly and with transparency.
Right.
It's, you know, go ahead, take it away.
Well, before we get there, I just want to say on the team aspect, one of the things that most organizations don't do, in my experience, is evaluate the degree of severity of the crisis. And you know, what I like to do is based on the nature of the organization, the industry they're in, you know, say this is, as you say, Jen, an all-hands-on-deck crisis. We need to have our call center open 24/7. We need to have additional people come in to take calls. We need to have our lawyers on standby 24 hours a day. But there are other crises that don't need that. We need to have the crisis center open during normal business hours, and then somebody just watching for something that might come up during the night. I mean, there are degrees of crisis, and you need to identify what the criteria are so you know what kind of team to have in place. The team should be ready to go, right? But you should be able to send out the message saying, we're in code red, the code red team comes into play. You know, this is an orange crisis, so that team gets together. Also, you know, in terms of the lawyers, I just want to, I love lawyers. You know, half of my family are lawyers, so yeah, I certainly respect what they do. In the corporate world, what they're trying to do is minimize risk, and generally, in their view, and this is because they have been trained this way in law school, they're actually taught this, that the best way to minimize risk is to not say anything, and therefore they counsel no comment as often as they can. We know, and there's tons of data and research to support this, that saying nothing can cause more problems than saying something. And you know, what the lawyers are worried about is that you're going to start mindlessly blathering and saying something that's going to get you in trouble. And between saying nothing and mindless blather, there's a lot of room to say things that are going to help the organization rather than, you know, end up being something the lawyers have to deal with in court. So the first thing is to acknowledge, when it comes to responding quickly and with transparency, is to acknowledge that the crisis has happened and that you're aware of it. There are a lot of lawyers who will advise and CEOs who believe that we shouldn't say anything until we have something to say. And that's absurd. I think what you need to do now is get out there in the social channels and through the media and say we are aware of this situation and we are looking into it and we will have something to say as soon as we have adequate information. But if you don't acknowledge it, you look like you're not aware of it while everybody's talking about it, and information abhors a vacuum. And if you're not talking, somebody else is going to be sharing information, and that's where people are going to go for insight and updates as to what's happening. A great model of this is the Centers for Disease Control. When the virus H1N1 was starting to spread, they were out with updates every half hour, even if there was nothing new to say, and that was to keep third-party voices from coming in and spreading panic. They would say, nothing new, we'll be back in 30 minutes with an update, and everybody sort of hung on them, waiting for the next update, rather than listen to all of the people who were panicking or spreading misinformation.
And that's a textbook example of how you can keep people with you as the expert on this. Give them the next anticipated, nothing now, but 30 minutes, we'll be back. That way they know every 30 minutes they're not, as you said, filling the void with their own creativity or additional outside voices that might not know exactly what they're talking about. And I think that the internet and social have, of course, contributed quite a bit to that aspect of it. It's amazing to me how quickly rumors, conspiracy, and creative memes show up.
Even fake news.
Right. Exactly. What happens is, of course, if someone's not there saying, here's what's going on, there's someone else saying, well, here's what I think might be going on. And that's where things start to kind of spiral out of control, especially if they're respected voices. Because it's not just going to be, people trying to fill the void that you can easily ignore. There are going to be people out there, web traffic desires being what they are, who are going to throw their lot in and try and figure out on their own what's going on without facts.
Right. Yeah. One of my favorite examples of a crisis, and it's being handled well, and it's getting a little long in the tooth, but it's still great, was when Monty was at Ford, and there was a guy who was running a little bulletin board for owners of the I can't remember what model it was, but it was a Ford pickup truck, and he got a cease and desist letter from the Ford legal team saying you're violating. It was a Ford Ranger. They said you're violating our trademark. You need to take the site down. You need to turn the domain over to us. It was called the Ranger Station. And the guy, was just a Ranger owner who loved his truck and wanted to build community around other people who loved the Ford Ranger. And so he posted on the message board, I got this from Ford, what should I do? And all of his fans, all of the members of that community piled on, right? They notified the auto press, they flooded the Ford customer service lines. They were posting about it. Scott wakes up in the morning and checks his computer, and there's a bunch of messages going, Scott, you need to deal with this. And what he did was he tweeted absolutely everything. He tweeted he was aware of it. He tweeted he was on the phone with legal to find out what was going on. He tweeted when he got a meeting with legal. He tweeted when he was on his way to the meeting with legal. I think he tweeted something like 132 times over 9 hours. And what that did was that it kept everybody paying attention to Scott rather than running out and spreading rumors. And, when the thing was resolved, it was resolved, and it never elevated to the level that it certainly could have.
Exactly.
Jordan, if we can go back to
Yeah.
the slide before that, one of the things that we're seeing happening these days is that whole meme issue. You can see here that looks like Southwest's logo, but what it says is "We beat our competitors, not you." That was obviously not Southwest that put that graphic out. That was some clever internet user who was following the United issue and put that out. There was one that was actually put out by another airline, not a U.S. airline. It was an international carrier. But they put out a fake graphic saying we have updated our airline app, and new on that is we've gotten rid of the drag and drop. It looked like that was the software update notice in it. But there were probably 20 of these memes that went out, over which United had absolutely no control. And when people laughed at one of them, they shared it with their friends. And that's how these things go viral. And, man, that does not help.
Right, and another thing to kind of just, put in the back of your mind here is that Southwest had nothing to do with this meme, but there's their logo, there's their registered trademark. So you have to, when you're thinking about crisis planning and crisis communication and how social fits into it, don't just think about your brand being affected, with the actual crisis. Think about how your brand might get drawn in. I don't believe that Southwest did anything about this, and I think that was probably smart of them. They kind of just stood back and waited for it to, run its course and whatever. I think that honestly, running out and saying you're using our logo in an inappropriate fashion and freaking out and sending out cease and desist letters probably would have been a bad thing. That sounds like a silly thing to point out, but I'm sure that there was someone at Southwest saying, hey, we can't allow our logo to be maligned like this. What should we do? And thankfully, I don't remember seeing anything. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed. But just something to kind of keep in mind when you're looking at this as a crisis planning thought.
And sometimes these can be self-inflicted. There was an instance, and it was around the annual 9/11 remembrance, where I think it was AT&T put up an image on a tweet, and it was it had to do with the two beams that were coming out of the former locations of the World Trade Center towers, and I think it was somebody holding up their AT&T phone to take a picture of that. And I'm sure that they had the best intentions. I don't believe that anybody in the AT&T marketing team said, let's be crass and commercial around 9/11, but nevertheless, that was how a lot of people looked at it. They said, oh my God, look, they're trying to sell one of their phones on the backs of the 9/11 tragedy. Now, I happen to agree with one guy out there who said, that, brands should just keep quiet for 24 hours. There's no reason to, assign your brand trademark logo to a tribute. Nobody's going to think less of you if you didn't, but you run a tremendous risk of people saying you're trying to sell product on the back of this tragedy. But one thing that I think that a lot of organizations don't do when they end up with a self-inflicted crisis over something like that. There was another one after the Boston Marathon bombing. I think it was Epicurious that sent out links to breakfast menus because the rescue workers there must need a nice hot breakfast after all the work they've been doing. And they ended up having to apologize. It's just take a step back before you launch it. Project yourself out a month later and ask yourself what went wrong, and look at it through that lens. And that might allow you to see how people will react to it, because your best intentions can still go awry if you don't look at it through that filter of the consumer who sees it cold up on their screen.
Well, exactly. And I think that something like that just happened recently, back in April. And I think that this is true for global brands. When you have global brands whose headquarters are, in, say, I don't know, New York or San Francisco or anywhere, and this was Adidas. And Adidas, the day after the Boston Marathon, sent out a promotional email that said, you survived the Boston Marathon.
Yes.
Well, you know, everybody, you think about running a marathon, 26 miles. I mean, my goodness, that is something that's extremely taxing. Saying, hey, you survived that marathon is probably a fairly common thing to say when someone actually, you know, manages to get through it. The reason that this was, of course, so inappropriate was it was the Boston Marathon, which just a few years ago, 3 people lost their lives watching. So I don't think that it was, nobody clearly thought that one through, and it's probably because not being in Boston, they didn't put it together that surviving a marathon would carry a significantly different connotation in that context. They apologized quickly, which is what they should do, and that's what you should always do, especially if you inadvertently cause your own crisis.
Yeah, one of the reasons I raised the AT&T issue around 9/11 was they ended up having to apologize 3 times, and that's because the first 2 weren't adequate. They wanted to minimize the damage, so the first one said something like, "We're sorry, some people took this the wrong way." And
Yeah,
the reaction was, "Oh, we took it the wrong way. It wasn't that you did something that you shouldn't have done." Then they came out and were a little more forthright in, you know, taking responsibility, but it still was a tweet, and it ended up with the CEO writing a post on a blog that went into some detail and you know, being abjectly apologetic. That finally was able to, you know, allow them to put this behind them. But if one of the things about responding quickly is, if you know you did something wrong, if you know this is your fault, you know, say so, apologize, and then what your mission becomes is letting people know what steps you're taking to make sure this never happens again. I remember the St. Valentine's Day freeze at JFK, where JetBlue had planes wheels frozen to the runway, with people stuck on those planes for 13 hours, where they ran out of battery power, and they ran out of food, and the toilets backed up, and you know, people were very upset. The very next day, Dave Nealman, who was CEO at the time, showed up with a YouTube video. You could tell he wasn't reading a script. He was genuinely and visibly shaken by what had happened. He talked about how appalled he was, and then he ran through the steps that he was taking to make sure this never happened again, including things like having people who are not at the airport on call to come in and deal with this at a moment's notice, something that they didn't have in place at the time. That's what people want to hear, is how do I know that this isn't going to happen to me the next time I do business with your organization? So, you know, apologizing and moving on. In fact, there was a study out of Oxford 11 or 12 years ago, publicly traded companies in crisis, and they divided them into 2 groups. So one group were the ones that took responsibility, apologized, and said what we're going to do about it, and the other one is the group that said no comment. And they looked at the share price the day before, the day of the crisis, and then at the end of the fiscal year. And the ones that apologized recovered share price the fastest, and at the end of the fiscal year, they had exceeded the price the day before the crisis had hit, whereas as a group, the ones who said no comment struggled to regain share price, and as a group had not been able to get above what the share price was the day before the crisis hit. That's pretty empirical evidence from my perspective that, you know, listening to the lawyers and saying no comment is not going to serve your bottom line.
Exactly. Okay, well, you know, just to do a quick touch base on the monitoring aspect of this, making sure that you don't neglect your monitoring tools is incredibly important, because over the course of a crisis, especially if it's a drawn-out one, the language used will change, and you might not always capture everything that you need to if you don't adjust for that on the fly. So refining keywords, making sure that you've got the most relevant coverage. If it started off being referred to as, you know, an ecological disaster in XYZ state, and then turns into your brand name dash disaster in the making, make sure that you plug that new name, as painful as it might be, into either your hashtag tracking on Twitter or your media mentions on the news, and then use that collected coverage to help structure your responses. Because as the tone, as the process of it changes, and the BP disaster is a good example of this, where it started off, if I remember correctly, kind of being referred to by the platform, and then the platform that the design, and I'm drawing a blank on even the name of it.
The Deepwater Horizon.
Thank you. And it is still called that, but it pretty quickly translated, and it became the BP oil spill.
Right.
So if you weren't tracking both of those, you're not going to capture all of the mentions, and like it or not, you're going to want to have all of that data for your post-crisis analysis.
Yeah, and I think hashtags are, I'm reading articles every now and then these days talking about how hashtags don't work and marketers shouldn't use them. But the average person out there does, particularly on Twitter and Instagram. And by the way, the number of organizations that are monitoring Instagram leading up to and during a crisis is very small, despite the fact that marketers have figured out its importance. And the fact that there are so many influencers out there, when you have a crisis that gets very public, Instagram is important to look at, and hashtags rule on Instagram. So, collect all the ones that people are starting to use about you. Anybody who watches John Oliver's show on Sunday night, he always introduces a hashtag every episode, and heaven forbid your company should be the target of his commentary, but if you become that hashtag, then that's something that you need to start monitoring in a big way. And how are people talking about it? Hashtags are important in a crisis.
Exactly. Okay, so after the crisis is over, you finally managed to get more than 2 hours of sleep on your organization's floor. And you have all of this data, mountains of it, from the past, hopefully short time period, but who knows, it could have been quite a while. If you don't have automated sentiment analysis, you're going to probably have to do a lot of backtracking, which is kind of going to be painful, but it's important because you'll be able to see roughly when the tide turned, when things started changing, and you can detect this, either by the volume dropping or the sentiment changing, or potentially even going from the larger publications drifting down to just a handful of smaller ones or more local ones or something along those lines. So you'll see these kind of bell curves, and what you want to do is really take a look at different points of that crisis and figure out, okay, negative spiked again midway through this. Why? Is it something we did? Did some additional information come out? Did a public official make a comment on this? And really kind of do, sorry to use the language, but post-mortem on it. Figure out exactly, what could have caused a spike or a drop, and you incorporate that into your crisis planning for what will hopefully never happen again, but it'll be involved in your training.
Yeah, and another thing to look at post-crisis is talking to employees. They've been right in the thick of it. They're paying close attention. And to think that everything can just go back to normal, I think is not realistic. So bringing them into the loop about what you're doing post-crisis, making sure that they understand any changes that you're making in your processes and procedures. We know, again, pointing to the Edelman Trust Barometer from this year, that your frontline employees are your most credible spokespeople. So if you have an employee ambassador or advocacy program in place, thinking about how to leverage that during and after a crisis is well worthwhile. But also taking what you've learned from the crisis that you have just emerged from and going back and revisiting your crisis plan. What didn't work here? What do we need to fix? What do we need to update? What do we need to change? I think is very important, and that might include what do we need to be monitoring. And Jen, you made a really important point in terms of the sentiment analysis. Monitoring is one of the two M's, right? The other is measurement. And to go in and try to measure what the impact of the crisis was and what people were talking about and where the turning points were afterwards is really tough. So part of your crisis planning needs to be an understanding of what metric tools, what analytic tools you're going to use during the crisis so that you have the right data both during and afterwards to help you parse all of that information.
Exactly. It's all so important to do and plan for, and make sure that you have as much as possible done up front so that you're not scrambling quite as much during, and that you can wrap things up in a suitable fashion after.
All right, excellent. Thank you, guys. So I'd like to take just the last few minutes and cover some questions that we've had come up throughout the session. So just to kick off the question and answer portion, we had one that was asking about your thoughts of when and how a crisis can be flipped as more of an opportunity and interpreted instead as an opportunity.
Well, one tactic that I like, and I would not suggest employing this in every crisis situation. It's a matter of analyzing the specifics of the one that you're dealing with, but that's changing the conversation. And that can really become an opportunity. So, for example, there was a case maybe 2 years ago. One of the diaper brands, I think it was Pampers, introduced a newly reformulated product on the market. And one of the mommy bloggers who has, and mommy bloggers, if you're not aware of them, wield tremendous influence. And she had 2 children in diapers, and she started using the reformulated diaper, and her kids ended up with diaper rash, and she started writing about this. And the folks at Pampers, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's Procter & Gamble, the researchers came out and said, no, we did lots and lots and lots of tests. We have data. There's actually less diaper rash with these reformulated diapers than before, but of course people weren't interested in data. They were worried about whether their kids were going to get diaper rash if they used this product, and the media was picking up on this. And nothing they did was able to change, to turn the crisis around. It just happened that they hired a new marketing VP who started in the midst of that crisis, and she said, well, what's the common denominator here? It's not our diaper, it's rash. So they undertook a massive effort to talk about diaper rash, what the causes are, what the remedies are, and that's what everybody started talking about. And this mommy blogger kept trying to get the conversation to go back to this particular Pampers brand, but everybody had moved on at that point, and they were now talking about causes and cures of diaper rash. So it can serve you well to change the conversation if that doesn't end up looking, I mean, United couldn't have changed the conversation to,
Right.
Extra space in our economy plus seats. That would have looked self-serving. And, yeah, but if you can do this in a sincere way that satisfies the interest of the people who are talking about the crisis, it can really pay off for you.
I have an example of, and it's going to be highly specific depending on what the actual issue is or brand issue involved. But not that long ago, I was just hearing this on the radio a couple of days ago. Apparently, the most recent season of Orange is the New Black was stolen from a third-party processing something or other. And the group of hackers that stole this content basically tried to blackmail Netflix. And they said, if you don't pay us X amount of money, we're going to put this up on the web and everyone will be able to download it and watch it before the season starts. And Netflix, I think very wisely said, go for it. Do whatever you want to with it. There were a few things I think that factored into Netflix's thinking. The ones that were mentioned on the radio program were that, Netflix knows its customers. They know that they want to gather together in, viewing parties or watch this on their big screen. They don't want to go to their laptop, download some dodgy file sharing software onto their laptop, and then watch it in the corner of their, room or whatever on the teeny little screen. I think another part of it was a lot of people like to binge watch. They're not going to want to do this kind of piecemeal stuff. And at any rate, Netflix has the season done, right? What's it going to hurt them if they get more publicity? People are going to still want to watch it when it comes out, quote unquote, for real. So they kind of called these guys bluffs. They took a crisis, which could have been, a huge crisis, and they could have had their lawyers and whatever trying to find these guys, and they just kind of cut it off at the knees and said, that's not a problem for us. Go ahead. So it's going to be highly dependent on what the crisis is about how you can turn it around. Just be very careful, especially if the issues involved are death or serious injury. I can't say that often enough. I've seen so many brands step in it when it comes to newsjacking on things like that. Just don't do it.
Great, those were excellent examples. I was wondering if on the monitoring side you could talk a bit about recommended tools for monitoring crises and the kind of features within those monitoring tools that are really helpful during a crisis.
You want to go first on that one, Jen? Well, yeah. I mean, the thing is, there's a range of tools that go from free to incredibly expensive, and then you have organizations, Dell, Toyota, and others who cobble together from multiple tools a monitoring program. I mean, at Dell and at Toyota, there's rooms with 15 screens on the wall that's staffed by 5 people 24 hours a day. Watching this stuff. So, I mean, there's a range, but I mean, the simplest thing you can do is sign up for Google Alerts, right, around keywords. And then when something hits that has that keyword in it, you're going to get notified and you're going to see what's been published. And those are absolutely free, and you can set up as many as you want. For monitoring services, Custom Scoop is putting on this webinar. And Custom Scoop is a great product. It's not up there in the stratosphere of pricing. And the nice thing about it, and I don't work for Custom Scoop, so I'm not shilling for them here, is that it combines both digital and social media with traditional media. So you're going to find out when something gets aired on a TV station as much as you're going to find something get posted to CNN.com or somebody's website.
If I can just add a little bit, I agree with all of that. I think that the most important thing is that you figure out what your needs are as an organization on a day-to-day basis and what your budget is, and have something in place that you're using regularly that you're comfortable with. Because the last thing you want to be doing at the beginning of a crisis is figuring out where the drop-down list is for you to type in the keyword terms that you want to use. You're going to have enough going on that you don't want to be doing this as the crisis hits. So whatever you're using, figure out its ins and outs, learn that tool, be comfortable with it. A lot of organizations, and another thing is, if you're not doing this, if you have outside PR counsel, which a lot of organizations do, and I've worked in public affairs PR, and sometimes we were, had long-term clients that had crisis hit, and sometimes we were hired for crisis work. A lot of times, if you have outside PR counsel, they will have a tool that they use. So that's an avenue also. But I think, honestly, the best bet is to have something in place that you're comfortable with before a crisis hits, that meets your daily needs.
And if you don't have something already, create a requirements document. What do you want it to be able to do? Don't go with what your IT department says. We're going to use this because we're already using a different one of their products, and they're going to give us a good price. Make sure it does what you need it to do, and then go look at the products that are out there that offer those features.
Exactly.
Excellent. So I think we have time for one more. Um, so we have one that is asking you to speak to the most serious crisis you've ever worked on, and not necessarily that you need to name company names, but just why it was such a serious crisis, and maybe talk a little bit about the handling of that.
Hmm. I mean, I don't know if the most serious, but the most interesting one that I ever dealt with. I was director of corporate communications for an ophthalmic pharmaceutical company, and we also had a line of contact lenses. And I got a call from a reporter with a daily newspaper in Waco, Texas, and he said the police have just arrested a guy for selling contact lenses on street corners to school children. And you know, if you can imagine a classic double take from a movie, that was me. I mean, wait, what? But yeah, it turned out it was a couple of days before the prom, and he had tinted lenses in different colors that the high school girls were interested in because they wanted their eyes to match their prom gowns. And what the question was, are these your lenses? And of course, we had no way to know. The reason they suspected that was because we did have a manufacturing facility in Waco, Texas. So the answer was, I don't know. I will dig into this and see what I can find out. Let me know what your deadline is, and I will be sure to get to you before then. But in the meantime, if I sent you an advisory, can you get it out to your audience? And we did that with every media outlet in Waco. This predated digital and social media. But what the advisory said is that, and it was aimed at parents, it said contact lenses are medical devices. If your child puts one in her eyes that was not prescribed, it can do permanent eye damage. Make sure that your child is not wearing contact lenses or have contact lenses that were not prescribed. And we got that out over the radio news waves and into the nightly news reports on TV. And when it turned out it was not our lenses, they had been stolen off a truck. It was a competitor's product. Man, we ended up looking awesome because we were helping people save their children's eyesight. We were not behind the lenses that were being sold illegally.
Well, from my background, I have worked in both politics and PR, and so I've had a lot of very interesting crises, and they all seem incredibly serious. I do think that the ones that the one that stands out for me the most is the one where there were significant injuries and deaths involved with the product crisis. And it's when I got a front row seat at watching how PR and legal can butt heads. And it impressed upon me the importance of communication inside an organization. And the situation here was that we had, this was when I was at a PR firm, so we were not inside the company. We were the outside PR counsel. But then you also had external legal counsel, you had internal legal counsel, and you had internal PR. So there were a lot of different things going on, a lot of different voices, and no real single table around which everyone sat. And it made for a very bumpy road. So I think that the number one thing that I can say is if you are working with a company and you have a product that could ever potentially be implicated in a serious illness or injury, pharmaceuticals, even toys can be swallowed or have major product recalls. If you have multiple streams of information like an internal PR team and an external PR vendor, to have them all on the same page in some form. There's just no reason not to be now. This was before you had the ability to hop on to a, live streamed video conference call. Well, I mean, we had conference calls, but the idea that everybody could be on the same video would have probably been very helpful at that time, and it just wasn't an option. It is now. Make sure those communication streams are in place.
Great. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. We're almost exactly at our hour mark. So I would like to thank our hosts again for a really informative session. Their email addresses are right there if you have any follow-up questions for them. We also have CARMA's website and our Twitter handles if you'd like to follow us there. And as mentioned previously, we will have a recording of this on CARMA's YouTube channel, and the slide deck will be available on our SlideShare account. So we welcome you to check those out afterwards. If you had to step away, the whole thing will be available. So thanks again for everyone for attending, and we hope to see you at future CARMA webinars. Have a good day.